Florida is home to 11 units of the national park system. True to form and reputation, the Sunshine State's national park sites put its coastal resources front and center. As a peninsula surrounded on three sides by water, you'll find no shortage of water-based parks, recreation opportunities, and ecological wonders here to explore. But don't mistake these parks for being two sides of the same coin. From the mangrove forests of Biscayne to the coral reefs of Dry Tortugas, from the wetland wilderness of the Everglades to the sandy shores of Cape Canaveral, from the swampy sloughs of Big Cypress to the estuarine extravaganza of Timucuan, Florida's parks showcase the true variety and diversity of what America's shorelines have to offer. And don't think there's nothing for the history lovers here either. With a rich indigenous history and centuries of Spanish influence, Florida's historical parks and sites tap into an often overlooked era of American history. Today, we're covering them all, diving into the national park sites of Florida. Alright, I think it makes most sense to go geographically for this video, so we'll start way out in the Florida Keys, make our way up the peninsula, and then head across the Panhandle. Which means, of course, that our leadoff hitter will be Dry Tortugas National Park. The Dry Tortugas themselves are the westernmost extension of the Florida Keys. They are also the most remote and isolated of the Florida Keys, lying about 68 miles west of Key West. The 7 islands of the Dry Tortugas combine for just under 145 acres of land, and all are protected within the park boundary, but 99% of this park is water. Shocking, I know. Dry Tortugas National Park is home to some of the least disturbed coral reefs in the entire Florida Keys, playing home to both tropical and subtropical corals, fish, birds, and all manner of marine life. Roughly 46% of the park today has an added layer of protection called a research natural area, wherein no fishing or anchoring is allowed. This is a no-take area, and this is intended to let the marine life here live as undisturbed as possible. However, that does mean that fishing is still allowed in the other 54% of the park. Now, one of the other main resources this park is tasked with protecting is less a natural one and more a historical one. I'm talking, of course, about Fort Jefferson, located on Garden Key. Fort Jefferson is where by far the vast majority of park goers come to visit, as it is the only part of the park serviced by commercial operators, either the ferry or seaplane. Basically, if you want to visit any of the other islands or any other part of Dry Tortugas National Park, you'll have to get a private boat. Basically. Anyway, Fort Jefferson is the largest masonry structure located in the entire Western Hemisphere. It is made up of more than 16 million individual bricks. And also, it's not even done yet. The fort was originally begun in 1846 to protect a strategic military choke point out in the Gulf of Mexico, but construction was stopped in 1875. It was briefly used as a coaling station, and during both World Wars I and II, but was eventually protected by Franklin D. Roosevelt as a national monument instead in 1935, before being redesignated as a national park in 1992. Next, we'll move from the far western reaches of the Florida Keys to the far eastern, to Biscayne National Park. This is yet another national park that is mostly water, about 95%. This park is primarily focused on preserving the coastal and marine resources of Biscayne Bay, which consists of 4 main types of ecosystems. On the park's eastern edge lies the northernmost extension of the Florida Reef, one of the largest coral reef systems in the entire world. Then, moving back in towards the coast, you have the northernmost extension of the Florida Keys themselves. The largest in the park is Elliott Key. Between the Keys and the mainland then lies the shallow waters of Biscayne Bay itself, another distinct type of ecosystem. And then finally, on the mainland of Florida itself, the park protects a narrow strip of coastal mangroves. It may seem like each of these ecosystems are separate from one another, given how different they look, but actually one of the most important aspects of this park is that it does protect all of those resources together. They all influence and interact with one another, and the health of one is directly related to the health of the other. For instance, the mangrove forests filter and settle sediments draining from the mainland before they enter the bay, helping to preserve its overall water quality, which corals are extremely sensitive to. See how they're all connected. This park is also famous for shipwrecks, with 40 known sites located within its boundaries. It even has a unique underwater trail dedicated to these sites, the Maritime Heritage Trail, complete with identification buoys to mark wreck locations, and a personal favorite of mine, underwater interpretive signs. Now that's really freaking cool. I have a whole video about this unique trail if you'd like to learn more. Also, the park's main islands, particularly Elliott Key, were threatened through private development pressures in the past, but the park efforts themselves actually helped to stave off those development pressures and ensure the islands remained as undisturbed as possible. Next up, we'll move to perhaps the most famous national park in Florida, Everglades. Believe it or not, Everglades is actually the third largest national park in the lower 48, clocking in at 1.5 million acres. Only Death Valley and Yellowstone are larger. The park also protects the largest wilderness area east of the Mississippi River. Also, Everglades National Park only protects a small portion of the overall Everglades ecosystem, which begins way up near the headwaters of the Kissimmee River and Lake Okeechobee. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas famously said of the Everglades that, quote, they have always been one of the unique regions of the earth, remote, never wholly known. Nothing anywhere else is like them, end quote. And she's totally right about that. The Everglades ecosystem is very unique. It's often described as a river of grass because of the vast expanses of flooded grasslands that flow out of Lake Okeechobee and ultimately empty out into Florida Bay. This river is more than 100 miles long and over 60 miles wide. And yeah, this water literally does flow like a river, just really, really slowly. So slow, in fact, that a single drop of water leaving Lake Okeechobee will take approximately an entire year before it drains out of the Everglades hydrological system. For every horizontal mile traveled, this water making its way through the Everglades system only loses 2 inches of elevation. For all intents and purposes, this is basically flat, but the water still flows. And that flow is an incredibly important hydrological and ecological process, storing an enormous amount of fresh water that provides habitat for 350 species of birds, 300 species of fish, 40 species of mammals, and 50 species of reptiles, not to mention iconic and endangered species like Florida panthers, American crocodiles, and West Indian manatees, in addition to the largest mangrove forest in the Western Hemisphere. In fact, so great are the Everglades' biological resources that Everglades National Park was the first national park established to protect not an iconic or monumental geographic feature, but an entire ecosystem, complete with its full assemblage of plants and animals. However, this ecosystem is also one of the most endangered in the United States, thanks to drainage projects and urban development all around its boundaries. Currently underway, though, is the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Project, a massive multi-decade, multi-billion-dollar restoration effort that will go down as one of the largest ecosystem restoration projects in American history. I have an entire video about how we broke the Everglades if you're interested. But for our next park, we'll move slightly north to Everglades' smaller cousin, Big Cypress National Preserve. Big Cypress was, along with Big Thicket in Texas, one of the first national preserves in the United States. I explained all this in my Types of National Parks video, but essentially a national preserve is meant to protect the same types of resources as a national park, but is more permissive in what uses it allows inside the park. So at Big Cypress, this means hunting, oil and gas extraction, grazing, off-road vehicle use, and traditional indigenous practices are allowed to occur within park boundaries. And also alligator Alcatraz, you may have heard of it. Yeah, it's also located within the boundaries of Big Cypress National Preserve. In fact, the jet port on which alligator Alcatraz is located is actually the entire reason Big Cypress National Preserve was even created in the first place. Basically, in the 1960s, the state of Florida wanted to build the world's largest jet port to accommodate newly created supersonic passenger jets. But they couldn't do it over populated areas because of the noise So they bought a bunch of land out in the swamp to build it, but then a whole bunch of people, including environmentalists, hunters, and sports people, and indigenous tribes, got really mad, and they worked together not only to stop the construction of the jetport, but to protect these swamps forever, thus resulting in the creation of Big Cypress National Preserve. They specifically created the National Preserve designation here to accommodate the wide range of users and interests that had come together to protect these swamps, hence the allowance of all the uses I mentioned earlier. Also, this had the added benefit of more or less enlarging the protections of the greater Everglades ecosystem, since Everglades National Park is literally right next door. From there, we'll head to the outskirts of Sarasota and St. Petersburg to the De Soto National Memorial. This park was originally created in 1948 to commemorate the landing location of the Hernando de Soto expedition in 1539, the first organized European expedition of the southern United States. Although it is apparently disputed if the expedition even landed in this exact spot or not. Today, though, the memorial's purpose has expanded to interpret the more complicated and controversial nature of the expedition. Because while the expedition led to invaluable geographic and cultural knowledge that informs our understanding of this region at this time, thanks to its extensive records and documentation, the 4,000-mile journey was also one of pillaging, violence, and enslavement toward the region's indigenous inhabitants. By the time De Soto died on the expedition after crossing into Arkansas, hundreds of Spaniards and thousands of indigenous inhabitants had been killed. The site today is small, just 26 acres. It features a small visitor center with interpretive material and exhibits, a short nature trail, a reconstructed living history village known as Camp Uzita, open January through April, as well as fishing and boating opportunities off the park's shorelines. Then we'll skip back across the peninsula to the Atlantic coast to Canaveral National Seashore. You might be familiar with Cape Canaveral, where the US has launched rockets into space for decades, but directly adjacent to those launch facilities lies 24 protected miles of the most undeveloped stretch of Florida's Atlantic coast. Canaveral National Seashore protects more than 57,000 acres of barrier island, coastal lagoon, hardwood hammocks, and pineland forests. So imagine your typical Floridian beach, but then take away all the condos, houses, and restaurants, and add back all of the native plants and animals, and that is basically Canaveral National Seashore. Now, that's not to say there aren't development impacts here. In particular, the giant rocket launching facility right next door poses a whole host of environmental challenges. In fact, when the National Seashore was first created, the Interior Department actually opposed it because they were worried about the difficulties the launches would pose for managing the seashore. And sure enough, there are indeed closures and restrictions to the seashore during scheduled rocket activity. But other than that, Canaveral National Seashore is home to your typical assemblage of beach activities, swimming, fishing, boating, things like that. And also, apparently, there's a nude beach here. I can honestly say that's the first time I've come across something like that when researching these videos. But yeah, if you want to get naked at a national park, this is the place to go. Moving up the coast, we'll come to Fort Matanzas National Monument. Fort Matanzas was a Spanish-constructed coquina limestone watchtower that guarded over the southern entrance to the major Spanish city of St. Augustine, just north of here. Basically, the city is protected by a barrier island all along its southern and eastern reaches, and the main defenses in the harbor are located at Castillo de San Marcos, which we'll talk about next. Thus, if you wanted to reach it / attack it from the south, you'd have to enter the Matanzas River at the Matanzas Inlet, making this a very strategic location, thus the fort. Funnily enough, though, despite being in such a militarily active, contentious area, the fort only fired upon an enemy one time in its entire history, during an engagement with the British under James Oglethorpe. After that, Florida began flip-flopping between Spanish, British, and finally American control, and Fort Matanzas rapidly deteriorated as nobody ever used it. Once it was under American control, it never even saw troops stationed there. By 1924, the fort was restored and proclaimed a national monument. Also, somewhat uniquely for a fort like this, it's only accessible by boat. You can drive to the monument itself, which does contain some land on the vehicle-accessible Anastasia Island, But if you want to visit the island itself where the fort is actually located, you'll need to take a Park Service ferry across the river. When I went, the ferry was closed because of hurricane damage, but it looks to be back up and running now, but it has a specific schedule and stuff. Just look at it beforehand. Then just up the Matanzas River from Fort Matanzas is our next site, Castillo de San Marcos National Monument. Both the Castillo and Fort Matanzas were military linked with one another because, again, they were part of the main defenses for the city of St. Augustine. The Castillo, however, is way bigger than Fort Matanzas, as it was the main defensive fortification for the militarily important St. Augustine. And seeing as how St. Augustine is the oldest European established city in America, it only makes sense that the Castillo de San Marcos is also the oldest masonry fortification in the United States. It is famously constructed out of coquilla limestone, a sedimentary rock made out of fragmented shells of various marine invertebrates that's found in the nearby area. The Castillo is located smack dab in the middle of downtown St. Augustine today and is one of the city's biggest tourist attractions. The Castillo has changed ownership and names at various points throughout its history. Obviously, Castillo de San Marcos was its original name when it was under Spanish control, but when Florida was ceded to the British in 1763, it became known as Fort St. Mark instead. Then, in 1783, Florida went back to Spanish control, who restored the original name before becoming Fort Marion when Florida became an American possession in 1821. It remained with that name until Congress restored it finally back to Castillo de San Marcos in 1942. Throughout its history, in addition to being a military fortification, the Castillo has been used as a military prison for various indigenous fighters, including the Seminole, Apache, and Cheyenne, and was also one of the primary entry points for runaway slaves to enter Spanish Florida, where they could then be freed. The Castillo was established as a national monument in 1924 and decommissioned as a military installation in 1933 after 251 continuous years of military use. Continuing further north still, we enter the Jacksonville area, where we encounter a unique duo of NPS sites. We'll start with the larger one, Timucuan Ecological and Historic Preserve. Timucuan is the only NPS unit to carry that specific title, although in actuality it is formally classified as a national preserve. Florida's second, meaning only Alaska has more national preserves than Florida. This park is 46,000 acres of mostly coastal wetlands and estuarine environments, and is one of those parks that the Park Service manages with partner organizations. In this case, those are the City of Jacksonville and the Florida State Parks Department. Jacksonville is one of the largest urban areas on the East Coast, and thus Timucuan is one of the most important protected areas on the East Coast, providing refuge for countless coastal species and recreation opportunities for a large urban population. But also remember that the name of this park is a unique two-parter. Historic is specifically in the name, and there is a lot of history on offer here, even if it might not seem like it based on the looks of things. Archaeological evidence traces 6,000 years of human habitation to this area. The park is actually named after the Timucua people, an assemblage of independent tribes who shared a common language. There's evidence of old Spanish missions here, as well as historic sites related to the area's plantation history. Kingsley Plantation, located within the park today, is the oldest preserved plantation in the state of Florida. There's even French history here at Fort Caroline National Memorial, which is the next park on our list. Fort Caroline is somewhat unique. It is enclosed entirely within and managed by the Timucuan Ecological and Historic Preserve, but is technically considered to be a legislatively distinct unit of the national park system, as it existed prior to the designation of Timucuan. Basically, it got to stay as its own thing, but was just incorporated into the overall new park boundary for Timucuan. Fort Caroline, though, was actually the site of a former French settlement. Yes, a French settlement. You don't really hear about them in this region. We're mostly dealing with Spanish, English, and American settlements here. But yes, a full year before the Spanish established St. Augustine, a French Huguenot expedition established a colony here in 1564 at the mouth of the St. Johns River. The Spanish didn't tolerate this for long, though, given their claims to Florida and the fact that these settlers were Protestants. And eventually they attacked Fort Caroline, taking roughly 50 prisoners and massacring the remaining French defenders. This was one of the final attempts at French settlement in this area of North America. And also, we don't know the exact location of the fort still to this day. Have a pretty good idea. The fort is believed to have been located next to a bluff overlooking the St. Johns River, which is where Fort Caroline National Memorial was established and is located today, and where the Park Service has erected a replica fort for visitors to interact with. And finally, we will head all the way across the Florida Panhandle to our final national park site of the day, Gulf Islands National Seashore, which Florida actually shares with Mississippi, but not Alabama. Some of the coastal islands of Alabama were originally considered for inclusion in this park, but ultimately were passed over for the final designation. I don't know why. There's probably an interesting story there, but this is not the type of video where I go looking for a deep dive on that sort of thing. I go down enough rabbit holes when I research these videos as it is. It's a wonder I'm even able to stop long enough to write this video for you at all. Anyway, you'll notice this is now the second national seashore we've discussed for Florida, which ties it with North Carolina as the state with the most national seashores. I feel that's only fitting for a state surrounded on 3 sides by the ocean. Also, Gulf Islands is the largest national seashore in America, protecting 160 miles of shoreline and over 135,000 acres in 2 different states. It's also Florida's most visited national park site and the 6th busiest national park site in the entire United States, seeing over 7.8 million visitors last year. The Florida side has most of the park's area, which is why I'm covering it in this episode, and it is also the side with the most accessible beaches. Basically, if you go to just about any beach in the Pensacola area, from Destin down nearly to the Alabama border, you're visiting a beach located within Gulf Islands National Seashore. Mostly. There's like a small sliver of Perdido Key that's not in it, but there's also some areas on the mainland under protection of the National Seashore, including the Naval Live Oaks Nature Reservation, which I know I said I wasn't supposed to go on any tangents like this, but there is a case to be made that the Naval Live Oaks Reservation was actually the first protected place in America, way back in 1828. For you public lands history nerds out there, that predates the Hot Springs Reservation in 1832. Now, I'm going to leave it there so I don't get too distracted, but if you'd like to see a video on that, let me know down in the comments below. Now, the Mississippi portion of the Gulf Islands National Seashore is a little more remote and a little bit more difficult to access. The 5 islands in the Mississippi portion of the park are only accessible by boat and actually contain 4,000 acres of capital W federal wilderness. And there you have it, folks, the national park sites of Florida. A whole lot of marine, coastal, and wetland resources here in the Sunshine State. I know I said, like, literally in my last state video about Minnesota that perhaps no other state is best represented by its national park sites, but I feel like I might already have to eat my words on that one. Florida certainly makes a very strong case for having its national park sites best live up to its reputation. But what do you think? Which one of these is your favorite, and how many of the Florida parks have you been to? Let me know down in the comments below. Also, because I know it's probably going to come up on this video and I've been getting comments about it already, I'm probably not going to be making a video about the proposed Florida Springs National Park effort that's going on right now. There's just not enough information out there yet, and the effort really hasn't even gotten off the ground. If something changes, I'll cover it, but there's not enough there for a full video right now. But if you are interested in that topic and hearing my thoughts about it, I'm going to be covering it in my AMA on Patreon this month. Somebody asked about it. That's one of my perks that I have available at the $4 tier. And those types of videos, my AMAs and stuff, are perfect for topics like this. They're not going to get a full video, but I can still give you my thoughts over there. So if you want to hear my thoughts on the Florida Springs National Park effort, check out patreon.com/National Park Diaries. I'll be covering it later this month. All right. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.